Thank you. Hi, my name is Ryder Zebarth. I'm a committee member here, and I love coming to the book festival. It is my favorite writerly thing to do of anything else I do in life. This is our 6th, and I have to thank, before I do anything else, everybody on that board, which is the Nantucket Island Resorts, Wendy Schmidt, the Nantucket Athenaeum, the Inky Mirror, the WCAI, N Magazine, Haft Productions, the NHA, and the Dreamland. Without you, of course, we'd be nothing. So thank you very much for coming. We really appreciate it. Don't forget to fill out your little cards there so we can keep track of who comes and that's how we monitor you guys. Dan is a buddy. Dan came here the first book fest, and I have stayed in touch with Dan ever since. And he is the greatest. He's just the greatest. His second book is called The African Svelte. Dan is a masculine name given and a surname of Hebrew origin. It means God is my judge. Certainly, as God is his witness, every example of a vernacular blooper in his new book, The African Svelte, could, in fact, be substituted for its intended meaning. Veteran writer for the New Yorker magazine, former editor-in-chief at Random House, a 2-time O. Henry Story Prize winner, Dan is a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice pick and writer of very funny Facebook posts, whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Slate, and other publications so numerous we'd take up the entire 45-minute talk to tell you about them. Dan has bestowed upon his many fans 6 books, and at this, his second appearance at the festival, he brings us his 7th. This clever book is a must for every reader who not only appreciates good humor writing, but also the origins of the English language and all of its unintended warts, gangly growth spurts, and gaffes throughout the decades. Neither typos or autocorrects. Dan's collected words from writers that came across his editorial desk, the words, not the writers, that were sometimes more interesting than their straight-laced counterparts over the course of his career. Illustrated by Roz Chase with a foreword from Billy Collins, The African Svelte offers an Olympic perspective on linguistic semantics and verbal acrobatics. And with that, I welcome Dan Menaker.
Thank you, Ryder. Thank you all for coming. Thanks again to the festival for almost back-to-back appearances, interrupted by the genius Kevin Young, whose poetry is just about as good as we have these days. It's an honor to be here for many reasons. I'm going to just read a little about how this book came about and then go through some examples and talk about them a little bit. The lighting is not utterly propitious for the screenshot, but it'll do fine. The point is the words. Roz Chast's images are important. You'll see them plenty well. I want to say that when I've told people about this book and they kind of got I'll say, in a kind of nominal way interested, then when I said that Roz Chast was the illustrator, they sort of, perk up. So I thought about the second edition, I'm going to say by Daniel Menaker, by Chopped Liver with illustrations by Roz Chast. The sveltes presented in this book come from books, magazines, signs, flyers, and most abundantly the internet. And I should add that the first one I found was when I was reading The Slush Pile at the New Yorker, and I came across a short story submission which said the zebras were grazing on the African svelte. And it was done in all seriousness, and I wrote it down and I started collecting them with great sort of contempt and disdain, because how could they be so silly, but over the years you tend to soften a little bit, and I began to realize that these kinds of mistakes actually were quite brilliant, and not in Kevin Young's category, but in a way poetic. And if you think of svelte as a substitute for velt, you'll see that there's an appropriateness to the mistake. It's sort of trim, very handsome, not overgrown, and so in a way, it makes sense. Anyway, they were all caught by me or brought in by others from the wild. None were farmed, and they were homegrown only when I planted them myself. During the admittedly informal process of their collection, many sources have gone missing. So you'll have to take the genuineness of their outside provenance on faith. I've tried to bring as much rigor to this project as any sincere graduate school dropout could muster. But this is not a work of scholarship. To have made it one would probably have crushed its spirit. An important note, the rise of the web has brought with it an exponential proliferation of public, that is, published texts. This has in turn put svelte production into overdrive. Along with and trafficking in other argos like rap lyrics and text speak, the internet has also at least indirectly fostered a rich culture of linguistic improvisation. Slang, abbreviations, special vocabularies flow into the mainstream much more easily and quickly now than they used to, swelling it to a kind of flood stage. So you will see the internet as the provenance for many of the sveltes in the book. It's a blessing for discovery, but a kind of curse against the specialness of this kind of mistake. The more common the coin, the less valuable. So sveltes these days are less like diamonds than zircons, but they still sparkle. Since writing the book, friends and people I don't know who got hold of my email address, which is very easy to get hold of, have been sending me new ones. So I'm going to just show you a few that are not in the book. Quickly go through them to see how rich these sources are. This is one of the best ones. Somebody misheard the lyrics and wrote them down that way. I kind of like that one. Gladly. I didn't know first of all, I didn't know bears could be cross-eyed. And secondly, I didn't know that there was a specific one named Gladly. And that he was a Christian, and all those things. So that's a good one. And here's a bunch. His new power is exasperating his corrupt tendencies. You will begin to see the fleas jumping off the dog. That's about white people who work in the White House and how they'll soon be kind of fleeing from the White House. I love Vanilla Envelope. It has a sort of coloristic appropriateness. She'd come in with a shiatsu, which I can't quite figure how you could carry a shiatsu, but there you go. One of the best, please do not touch bread with hands, please use tongue. Go figure. And a very timely one that actually comes from 2 years ago. We must stop the muslin invasion. Let's get back to cotton or whatever the substitute is. So, without further ado, a perfect svelte, because the mistake is not a mistake. It means no more farewells. Let's get going. And we're going to start at exactly the right place, from the gecko. In Malay, onomatopoeia calls what we call geckos geckoks, after the way they vocalize. There are more kinds of geckos, 1,500 species, than of any other lizard, and they have autotomy. That is, they can shed their tails in a pinch as an appetizer to throw predators off pursuit of the entree. They can just say, here, take the tail and leave me alone. They have no eyelids. They lick their eyes to keep them moist, and they refresh their color vision, which is 350 times more discriminating than ours. They have sticky substances on their feet, and they often walk across ceilings in the tropics, and they are considered almost like pets down there because they eat insects. You all know the Geico commercials, whose spokes animal is a gecko, and he's very, very slow. And I've never understood why, if you go and get a Geico insurance policy, 15 minutes can save you whatever dollars in insurance, because it's speed versus slowness. I don't quite get why the gecko is the spokes animal for the thing. Anyway, I got so interested in geckos that I'm going to interrupt the presentation, even though it hasn't started, basically, by showing you some other wonderful species. There's so many of them. He's looking very suspicious. He reminds me of Robert De Niro or whoever it was in that, "Are you looking at me?" This one you could play chess on, practically. Anyway, I just thought I would show that. And if you want to go to where geckos live, the chances are you'd find yourself in the throes of packing. How many times have you heard or read something like, "I just threw a lot of things into a suitcase and got to the airport as fast as I could"? Or maybe, I hope less often, "Throw your stuff together and get out of my house, Buster." The confusion between throw, T-H-R-O-E, and this one is a natural one, because the origins of both words include the notion of pain. In fact, it's possible that both words descend from the Old English thravan, to curl or to writhe, and packing does inflict a certain amount of pain on most of us. Unless you're like my late father-in-law, who used to pack 2 days before a trip and then look on smugly as other people scurried around trying to get ready. But then if throw generally connotes pain, as in death throes, what do we do with the throes of passion? What we do is recognize that we've associated sexual ardor with pain from the beginning. As John Cougar Mellencamp has said, "Hurt so good." So the word itself can be deployed for two contrasting psychological states, depending on its contexts. Speaking of travel, there's a kind that I think New Yorkers are particularly adept at, and that is jaywalking. This is a svelte that is very common, almost an alternate spelling now. And it makes sense because of the shape of the J, right? Instead of crossing the street, you sort of wander and kind of, you're drunk and you don't know where you're going. There seems to be some disagreement about the origin of jaywalk. Some say it descends from the impudence and boldness of the jaybird. That would be fine with me. Others say it comes from a sort of class term indicating bird-brain stupidity or drunkenness of the hoi polloi. It's a snobby word. Naturally, the word sprang up importantly around the turn of the last century in tandem with the springing up and occasional running down of the automobile. Starting in 1709, approximately, why does it say approximately 1709? Starting in the early 18th century, jay by itself evidently referred to a chatterer or an impudent person, and the word may be onomatopoetic, echoing the jay's call. Those who are prone to condescend to commoners are often full of hot air and therefore have too much self-esteem. You don't need to know much about roots or derivations to appreciate the suitability and inventiveness of this particular svelte, especially when you think of such expressions as build up steam, lose steam, head of steam, full steam ahead. steam being often a metaphor for energy, velocity, and anger, as in, I am really steamed. In this svelte, though, it works in opposition to its correct form. It comically identifies someone who is just puffed up, full of hot air, like another sort of vagrant picture reminds me of the Pillsbury Doughboy. That's full of self-esteem. We've now apparently entered the food region of the African svelte, and I hope the next few offerings will pass mustard. There appears to be no etymological connection between muster and mustard. The former comes down to us from the Latin monstrare, to show, to pass muster. The latter is what results from pressing a certain plant, vinum mustum, to make something called must into mustard. Despite the historical distance between the two words, I think it's clear that to cut the mustard bears a striking connection to pass muster. And if you dig around, as I have maniacally done, you will find that cut the mustard may well show a more interesting background than many of the other words and phrases anatomized here. For in the late 19th century in America, if a railroad wanted to build tracks across a farmer's land, the company had to see to it that the mustard weed, which tended to grow along the tracks, spread vigorously and threatened crops, was kept in check, cut down. So the phrase cut the mustard came to mean perform a service or function obligation well and properly. And it's not surprising that cut the mustard also came to have a sexual overtone, especially about men, as in the Ernest Tubb song, Too Old to Cut the Mustard, whose last verse implies that the girls no longer line up for the singer's favors. He not only can't cut the mustard, he can't pass muster. Where does food go after ingestion? Well, it eventually goes to your entrails. I ran across this svelte in the Independent Movie Database, among other places. The quote was, "He felt he gave it his best shot only to be strung up by his entrails." And again, there's an instinctive sense of correctness lurking, like entrails themselves, within this svelte, for among your entrails are the entrails of whatever you eat, your intestines, a word that has the same origin, intus, within. Whereas hiking end trails, I don't know if you're hikers, but there are actual trails called end trails, where you're going to come to the end of whatever path you've been taking. They couldn't be more external. So there's a kind of contrary fittingness in this word that we see often. Believe it or not, some people wear their entrails as a fashion accessory. This is not in the book, but it's something I came across. Those are socks that you can buy, apparently, and I thought that these were like intestines. But somebody, after they saw this presentation, wrote to me and said that those things are something else, and I can't remember what they were, but it immediately made sense. But I prefer to think of them as intestines, so I'm going to keep on doing that. So back up to the top of our physical selves, we have a restaurant reviewer who tells us, "My main meal was spaghetti with cuddle-fish sauce." Don't laugh on that one. What's wrong with you people? So anyway, it's supposed to be cuddle, obviously. It comes from an old Norse word for bag or testicle. Cuttlefish are remarkably ugly and improbable looking animals, and so to think of getting cozy with them is kind of revolting. Cuddle has a muddy background, either the obsolete English word cull, which means to embrace and is related to the word collar, or the C-O-L-L-A-R, or the medieval English couth, which means known or familiar, and thus at ease with. You can cuddle with whatever or whoever it is. In either case, cuddle-fish once again presents us with the dissonant appropriateness of many other mistakes that are, in fact, svelts. And now it's time for dessert, or at least a repurposed dessert, as in the case, and this is probably the best one in the book, I think, and others agree, in the case of a wire service report that this is an unprecedented disguise, not very effective. I've lost the source, but I couldn't make it up. I know I read it somewhere or someone sent it to me. And maybe that's as should be, considering the often secretive behavior of terrorists themselves. I wonder how seriously the threats of a terrorist outfitted this way could possibly be taken, to say nothing of how he planned to manage to sneak a baklava on board through the dessert detector. That's what I think that is. The word baklava probably comes from the Mongolian bela, to tie or wrap up or to pile up, which makes sense when you think of what a baklava looks like. It's a backward, it's a loan word from the Turkish. In the case of baklava, it has a Persian terminal fragment, the va. So the word baklava actually has 3 or 4 different sources. Just as linguists differ about the utter origin, the absolute origin of the word, Lebanese, Greek, Turkish, Armenian, and other native chefs argue about which of their nations is principally responsible for this invention. There's a big argument about who gets to claim the credit, and it reminds me of the word feta, which cheese, which has also been actually the ability to use the word in commerce has been before the European Union, and there's been a decision that only Greece can actually use in trade, in commercial trade, can use the word feta. So food origins can be very contentious. Everybody claims credit for a lot of them. A balaclava is the haberdashery of choice for many terrorists, and obviously the source of confusion here. It's a close-fitting woolen cap that shows only a small part of the face. The word earned its apparel usage at the Battle of Balaclava during the Crimean War. Everything involved here provides an excellent context for an excellent svelte. The region, the violence, the protection, the idea of concealment, and almost all of the letters. But, sadly, the opposite of sweetness. And speaking of terrorists, I can't help showing this picture, which is me about 40 years ago, and I could have hidden a baklava. I could have breezed right through, and God knows what I would have done. I could have hidden a hydrogen bomb under that mop. When presentations get too long, which is this one may be threatening to do, it's something that really gets my gander up. And that's the last one. I think I'll stop here. I have a very serious afterword, which I've decided just now I'm not going to read. But if you have any questions or comments or examples of your own, I'm not going to prolong this agony. I'd love to hear any comments or even boos if you want. I don't care. Can I go downstairs, or is someone going to have a question? Yeah.
I just wanted to say a beautiful, I think little children hear language a little bit differently, and I remember hearing a little child say, butterfly for butterfly.
Right. That's interesting. And kids do that all the time, and there's a word for that. actually. There are all kinds of terms for mistakes, and one of them is, and I can't remember which one it is, has to do with family mispronunciations, which, you know, you have kids or you're a kid, you say something wrong and it persists until you're 20, 30, 40, your mother, your father, your brother will refer to a flutterby instead of saying butterfly. And that's actually a category of words that, mispronunciations that persist from childhood. And most families have them. In my case, speaking of vanilla envelope, I couldn't say vanilla, I would say Volumnia until I learned better, but my mother and father and brother, until maturity, always said Volumnia. And people looked at us strangely. Yes, Jim.
Dan, I think you remember, or think this because it's in your book, that there are some words that are official words in the language that at one time were spells or were mistakes. Is that true?
Yeah, there's a lot. And the Oxford English Dictionary has a whole chart of words that are mistaken, that are beginning to be acceptable because they're used so often. And it's the only respect I can think of in which I happen to be conservative, because it's very troubling. So, for instance, for all intensive purposes is becoming in usage more prevalent than the supposedly correct form. And if you look in the OED, you'll see a whole list of things that to me are like, you know, felonies practically, but they're creeping into the language. The best example is maybe the one about, let's see. I'm sorry, I can't remember. It's, my mind was blown by our conversation this morning. I have nothing left. Yeah.
Do you think that there's a responsibility to try to protect the language, or do we just roll with this?
I'm sorry, could you say again?
Is there some responsibility to protect the language?
Right. There's two schools of thought in answer to that question. One is prescriptive, which is the responsibility. You shouldn't spell it X, or you shouldn't make this grammatical mistake. And the other is descriptive, which means our language, in particular English, of all languages, is very sort of flexible. And a good dictionary or a good grammar book will not be prescriptive only, but also just say, this is what people are actually doing. I tend to be on the prescriptive side, not, I think, just out of old fartism, but also because I think if we have certain set rules of communication, it just helps communication. That's all. It's just a matter of pragmatic usefulness, so that if there's a standard American English with standard American pronunciation and spelling and grammar, I think if kids learn it, it's very helpful to have that basic rubric. But the internet is really playing hob with these rules. So I tend to find myself sort of saying, no, you know, let's try to keep it at least. But as I say, these spelling mistakes are growing in number and acceptability. And anyway, yeah.
Question on sourcing. Have you gotten any threats of litigation from slush pile people who have discovered their accidents?
Well, no, but I did write a piece once for the Times, I think, about reading the slush pile. And I took a particularly unfortunate submission from somebody, and I changed it around enough so that it wasn't exactly this, it wasn't by any means the same, but the person recognized that I had made fun of his story, which is a very shameful episode in my life, and sued me, and sued the New York, and sued the Times. He lost because, in fact, I mean, he didn't lose, it didn't even come to trial, but that was in days when I had this great hauteur about what I knew about language and so on. But doing this book and subsequent life experiences has made me sort of even though I'm sort of conservative about language, it makes me also sort of respect the amazing flexibility and, you know, the sort of position of great fortune and good luck that I've had to have such a good education and so on. But no one has sued me, partly because the sources, for the most part, are there. I mean, it's not like I've accused, and I don't name the people from whom these came. Anybody else? Thank you very much.